He's our Latvian scholar achieving doctoral degree from Oxford University, and now in postdoctoral research he works with a project in Leiden University. Dr. Valters Negribs is representing from Netherlands, our next speech, so we have to make this technical. So I can see Valters.
Hello, everyone.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
So Walter, I will allow you to.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Hello, everyone. I also have some slides that I'm now going to try to present. Hopefully it works. So, no, not that one. Okay, do you see my presentation now?
Not yet. So I will check our. One moment.
Well, it says that you need permission to.
One moment, I will.
Or maybe it's on my end. It says go to privacy.
From our end, I see that you have allowance to present. So maybe.
Okay. It seems that there is some issue here. Maybe I clicked on the wrong button. Maybe I can try joining again if you don't mind waiting a moment. And if it doesn't work, then I'll just present without the presentation.
So I will, dear Walter, I will open presentation in my end.
Okay.
And then I will just, you will tell me when the next slide is.
Okay, let's do that then. Thank you, Arne. Well, I can see it myself, so thanks for putting that up. Yeah, so I'm not really going to address the topic of the conference, but I'm rather going to present my current research on the early history of yoga, which I'm doing as the Honda Fellow here at the University of Leiden. So Arne, can you please do the next slide?
Yes, one moment.
Yeah, so this is starting to look more like a book project, so I can't present everything in 20 minutes. So I'm just going to try to present a few main ideas. And well, I'm first of all trying to answer the most basic question, what was early yoga, namely in the earliest period before the composition of the Yogasūtra of Patañjali. And to do that, I'm trying to collect all the earliest textual passages, all the major textual passages that talk about yoga that are earlier than the Yogasūtra of Patañjali. And then there are a few other related questions that will follow from that, such as what is the relationship between early yoga and early Buddhism and Jainism. And also I'm thinking about any possible yogic institutions through which early knowledge and tradition of yoga might have been transmitted. And yeah, so next slide, please. Yeah, so my starting point is the Yogasūtra of Patañjali, which when accompanied by the commentary attributed to Vyasa together are known as the Patañjali Yoga Shastra, and which may be dated to around the 4th century of the Common Era. And this happens to be the earliest major and detailed Brahminical treatise on the topic of yoga. Now, while it may seem like a fairly ancient text from present-day perspective, from the perspective of the history of Indian literature and religion, it's actually a fairly young text. So we can say with some certainty that meditative practices resembling those explained in the Yogasūtra of Patañjali existed at least by the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era. And so there are around 1,000 years of history between these earliest passages and the composition of the Yogasūtra of Patañjali. And so what we're left with is little pieces of puzzle, shorter passages on yoga that we might try to collect and draw some conclusions from these. So next slide, please. So this is maybe a bit more technical. This is my take on what are the major early passages on yoga. I've divided these in 3 groups. The first is what I think are the earliest textual passages on yoga, which possibly date to centuries before the Common Era. And these include the Katha, which is labeled Yoga Vidi in its last section. And then I've given a few passages from the Mahabharata that I've collected. There are, of course, many other that make reference to yoga in passing, but these are the ones that explicitly label their teaching as either Yoga Vidi or Yoga Kritya or Yoga Shastra or Yoga Jnana. All of these mean something like the method of yoga or teaching of yoga and so on. And then there are passages that I think are a little bit later that we may date to the early centuries of the Common Era, and these include the Bhagavad Gita, which is included in the Mahabharata, and also texts like the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, Maitreya Upanishad, Pashupata Sutra, and so on. And now a major question here is, should we include Buddhist texts in our history of yoga? And here there are too many passages to mention. But first of all, we may observe that early Buddhist texts do not use the label yoga to refer to what they are talking about, but this label is adopted once they start using Sanskrit, and that happens in the early centuries of the Common Era. Until then, early Buddhists would use the so-called Middle Indic languages, various dialects of Prakrit, including Pali and so on. And as I will argue in a moment, I think the earliest Buddhist texts are actually essential for our understanding of the early history of yoga. So next slide, please. So here is the only picture I included in my presentation. This is a seated Buddha from Gandhara, dated to 2nd or 3rd century from the Common Era, from the British Museum. And from this time period, we have, I believe, virtually no representations of just yogis in visual sources. What we have is representations of seated meditating Buddhas and also meditating Jain practitioners, but we do not have yoga practitioners as such. And this is, I think, parallel to what we see in that text. As I said, we have actually extremely extensive literature in early Buddhism that treats the topic of seated meditation, whereas in Brahmanical texts, before the Yogasūtra, we only have these shorter passages that show up here and there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to state my main conclusion after surveying the passages that I listed before, the most recurring feature, which we could call maybe the defining feature of all of these early passages on yoga, is that the goal of yoga is to directly see the Atman, which we could translate as either the self or the soul, or alternatively Brahman, which is in any case identified with Atman already in earlier Upanishadic sources, where, however, they do not yet talk about yogic meditation. And in many of these passages, what happens is a luminous vision. This Atman or Brahman literally shines forth in a luminous form. And a phrase that we see repeated over and over again is, he sees the self by means of the self. pashyati atmanam atmana. So here, we may talk maybe about mystical experience. There is no duality, there is no subject and object. Atman, the self or the soul, is both the agent of seeing and also the thing seen. And this happens during seated meditation. At this period, they don't yet mention any specific names for asanas, outside Buddhist texts, that is, and they use various words to talk about meditation. Some of the more common ones are dhyana, samadhi, dharana. I'm not going to talk in more detail about them, but the underlying paradigm across all these texts is that the seated meditation is aimed at stopping all mental activity and, as it were, collecting all our senses, all our mental faculties within oneself and to look inside. And at this moment of complete mental stillness, complete mental cessation, it is expected, or rather it is said in the text, that at that moment it will become possible to directly see this inner self, this Atman or Brahman. So it becomes possible to directly perceive the perceiver, this luminous soul or consciousness that exists within us. Next slide, please. So there is another common trope in these early texts, which I think has been discussed less by most scholars working on early yoga, perhaps because it may seem more bizarre or more different from what we would associate with yoga nowadays. And that theme is the extraction of the soul, again Atman, from the body, rather than just perceiving it. And here I'm giving you just one example, a verse from Mahabharata, from one of these yoga shastras, which says that, or just as one would show a reed, having pulled it out from its stalk, so also the yogi perceives the soul, Atman, in his body as pulled out from it. And the same simile of the reed, or actually munja grass, and its stalk, is found in a number of other passages that talk about yoga, including the Katha Upanishad, several passages from the Mahabharata, also the Buddha Charita, which we will talk about in a moment, which is in which passage this extraction of the soul from the body is attributed to non-Buddhist meditators. There is also one passage in an early Jain text, which I have not cited here, where again this same image of grass and stalk is used, and it is attributed to materialists. And these materialists say, well, it is not possible to separate the soul from the body and say, this is the soul and this is the body. They're two different things. And therefore, these materialists think that, well, there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no karma. So there is no God, essentially. We are free to do whatever we like. And I think it's quite striking that exactly the same language is found in Brahminical, and as we'll see also in Buddhist texts, to say, well, yeah, actually what the yogi can do is exactly this thing, to separate the soul from the body and say, well, this is one thing and this is the other thing. And apart from all the spiritual aspects, and they're all of these practices in the path to liberation, what I think this achieves is an argument against materialists. So if we say that the yogis can directly perceive the soul, we're essentially saying that what we believe is not just some, a fairy tale. We're saying, well, there are people who can empirically justify our belief in, let's say, soul, reincarnation, the ethical laws of karma, liberation, and so on. And so I think that's one thing that is at play here. Next slide, please. Okay, here there is a surprising find. This is from the Pali Buddhist canon. This is from the Digha Nikaya, from an important text called the Samanyapala Sutta. I've given you just one passage here, but I think this is actually one of the most significant textual passages that we should consult when writing the early history of yoga. It gives a thorough account of how one becomes interested in liberation, renounces a society, becomes a wandering mendicant, cultivates ethical things, and then sits down in a secluded place, practices mindfulness of breathing, then practices meditation. Essentially does things that are in structure very, very similar to what we later find in the Yogasūtra, without the label yoga being used here. And here in this passage, I'm just going to read it and then we'll discuss it. So this happens when the Buddhist practitioner has entered deep into meditation in the fourth dhyana. They have this system of 4 dhyanas, 4 states of meditation. And what happens then in the translation of Thanissaro Bhikkhu, with his mind thus concentrated, purified and bright, unblemished, free from defects, pliant, malleable, steady, and attained to imperturbability, he directs and inclines it to creating a mind-made body, manomaikai. From this body, he creates another body, endowed with form, made of the mind, complete in all its parts, not inferior in its faculties. Just as if a man were to draw a reed from its sheath, the thought would occur to him, this is the sheath, this is the reed. By the way, they're using the same language as in these other passages I cited. The sheath is one thing, the reed another. But the reed has been drawn out from the sheath. Or as if a man were to draw a sword from its scabbard, the thought would occur to him, and so on and so on. And then after a while, he exercises influence with his body, even as far as the Brahma world, Brahma Loka. And now I would argue that this is essentially the same thing, couched in exactly the same language as yoga in early Brahminical texts. So in this passage, meditation is used to extract a mind-made body from the physical body, just like one extracts a reed from the sheath or a sword from its scabbard, and so on. And this non-material body then travels up to Brahma Loka, the heaven of Brahma. And again, I don't have time to give you extensive parallels in Brahminical texts, but yeah, if you look at something like Prashna Upanishad, we would find the same expression, manomaya kaya, mind-made body, which is extracted and travels up to Brahma Loka. And yeah, what conclusions we make from this is maybe for now left in the open. If I wanted to make a very sensationalist narrative, I could say, yeah, here we have it. Actually, the Buddha did teach that there was a soul. And this is the essence of Buddhism, because this is the passage where also the Buddhist awakening is described, and then he was maybe misunderstood, and so on and so on. There are, of course, other explanations. Maybe this passage is influenced by some earlier traditions of yogic meditation that were somehow included in the Buddhist canon, despite their apparent contrast with the doctrine of non-self, which eventually becomes the dominant, although not the only, doctrinal basis of Buddhism in India. Yeah, sorry, I see I'm running out of time, so maybe I'll conclude. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about Ashwagosha. There is not much time. So he's a Brahmin poet writing as a Buddhist in the 1st or 2nd century CE. He is extremely useful because we can date him with some certainty to these centuries. He wrote at least 2 texts to our extent, these poems, Buddha Charita and Soundarananda. And in these texts, he applies the label Dhyana Yoga, the yoga of meditation, to Buddhist meditative practices. This is also the first datable text to use the word asana, to refer in this case specifically to the Buddhist posture for seated meditation, known in Buddhist texts as Pariyanka, later known as Padmasana or the lotus posture. And he also applies the word yogi to Buddhist practitioner of meditation. And he is aware of moksha dharma, which is a label used in the Mahabharata. And what is significant is that he doesn't refer to theistic yoga. So I think we can conclude from this that he was aware of this non-theistic yoga of just perceiving the Atman within, and he maybe had a version of the Mahabharata which was non-theistic at this point. Next slide, please. So some concluding thoughts. So as I already discussed, in the earliest texts, yoga is a meditative technique for directly perceiving the soul or self. And this idea that yoga is direct perception of something, it remains a defining feature of yoga also in later centuries, where later schools of philosophy talk about yogic perception or yogi pratyaksha, which is this ability of the yogi to directly perceive something, not just the soul, but any object of meditation. Sorry, there is a word missing. So the goal of reaching Brahmaloka appears to have been especially important in early formulations of yoga. So, as you know, nowadays in contemporary Hinduism, gods like Vishnu or Shiva are maybe the main gods. But during these early texts, there seems to have been a period where Brahma is, so to speak, he lives at the top of the universe in this Brahmaloka, and then early yogis would ascend to that. And we also found the same thing in early Buddhist texts. And also from the earliest times, yoga is closely associated with separating the self from the body and ascending to luminous heavenly realms. Such yogic ascent, known as Utkranti in later Sanskrit texts, remains a key feature, for example, in Tantric and other later yoga systems. And another development that I didn't talk about that much in terms of citing any textual passages is that this tradition of perceiving the inner self is then adopted in theistic traditions, where they identify this inner Atman with either the god Vishnu, Narayana, or they say that yoga is a method for uniting this Atman with Shiva, as we see in the early Pashupata Sutra. That will be all. I hope that you got some interesting ideas about how early yoga was somewhat different from the yoga we know from contemporary practices. And I understand there is no time for questions. So thank you, everyone, and thanks to the previous speaker. And thank you, Arnie, for going through the presentation with me.